So I think we are presently broadcasting upon all of the available bandwidth that we can find on this fine Tuesday afternoon. We are still, as far as I can determine, the most watched religious broadcast on Twitch. Um, hey, you got to take what you can get, Terry.
Brag about what you can brag about.
It's a positive, right? It's a thing. Um, but how are you doing, Terry?
Oh,
On
I'm
this fine
great.
Tuesday. You seem really great. You seem a little cranky. You've been doing paperwork. You've been doing paperwork.
I've been
That's
doing
good
a
stuff.
lot of things. I've been doing a lot of things. I've been doing
All the
several,
things.
all the things.
Yeah.
Yeah. How
Okay.
about you? How are you doing today?
You know, I have the blessing of knowing that yesterday was not leg day, um, and
Yesterday
so I
wasn't
can
leg day for
stand.
me either. 2 days ago was leg day. And it is way worse today than it was yesterday.
Yeah, the
Which
phenomena
is why,
of
for those people who wonder why I'm not standing for today's broadcast, it's because if I try, I will probably fall literally halfway through the broadcast.
yeah, Terry's not standing because he's not quite sure he can stand. It's questionable, which is a good thing. That DOMS, that delayed onset muscle soreness, indicates you get some good work, and so you just need to keep it up. Um, but
Yeah,
I do have.
the problem with that is like that is the exact wrong motivation for somebody like me. Hey, you know how bad you feel right now? Keep it up. That's good.
Yeah, keep feeling bad. Hey,
Keep
it's
feeling
all.
bad. Yeah.
This is one thing I know you know. Motivation isn't what we need. It is always discipline because we have to do the things we don't like to get better. Same thing about physical stuff. It's absolutely true about churches and preachers. You know, do the things that are uncomfortable. That helps us grow in the areas where we need to grow.
I'd
Um,
like to say that the discipline I get while preaching doesn't hurt this bad, but the reality is, well, that's not true either because there's some people that are just as painful as my quads right now. So,
Probably true.
this
You're not wrong.
is
Uh,
low
so,
hanging fruit.
yeah.
Where's Edwin?
Yeah, he'll be here. You just called him out. He's basically
Edwin,
Beetlejuice.
Edwin.
Yeah.
Crozier, Crozier,
So,
Crozier.
in just a little bit, we're going to have the counter concept to our prior two discussions about unhealthy churches, and try very hard not to be really simplistic with it and to say healthy churches are not what we talked about the last 2 weeks. But we are going to break down some things I think will at least advance a dialogue and conversation about moving from unhealthy congregational community of Christian context to a healthy community of believers. I think that's something we need. Before we get though, we're going to spend a couple extra seconds, and I'm going to ask Terry a question because we haven't done that in a few weeks.
It's about
Um,
working. I asked you a question last week. That's not true. You did
that's
not
true, I
ask a
did.
question.
I also am old and can forget things quickly, either by accident or choice. So here's the basic question: your favorite hole in the wall barbecue place? Not a big chain, not the one everyone knows. Your favorite hole in the wall barbecue place. It's a tough one, right?
Well, I mean, I think if you're in the state of Alabama, my favorite Alabama barbecue place isn't really a hole in the wall. I mean, it's only one place, but everybody knows about Big Bob Gibson's. I mean, he is world renowned. He's won numerous Memphis national world championships, and he's the inventor of the white sauce in Alabama. So if you're a chicken and white sauce guy, which if you ever been to a barbecue place in Alabama, get the chicken and white sauce. It's like our thing here. Um, in Memphis, which is like my jam of the chains in Memphis, and it's just a chain in Memphis. There's 4 locations. Central, by far my favorite. But there's a place in Collierville that's literally just like in a strip mall called George's Fresh Barbecue. At least it was when I was there. He may have closed up during COVID. I don't know. But at the time, what set George apart besides the fact that he was like a competition barbecuer turned, livelihood kind of guy, was that they didn't keep anything till the next day, which, by the way, most people don't realize is common practice. You go somewhere and you think that the ribs are dry, maybe they taste old. It's likely because they are. Because the requirements to cook fresh mean that you have to get to to the pit really early in the morning. You have to
Mhm.
guess about what you're going to cook, and you got to be willing to eat the loss if you overcook. So that's kind of the hard thing. There's profit margin involved in this. There's labor. There's all kinds of stuff. But this guy, they only cooked so much, and they either closed when they ran out or they gave away what they had left at the end of the night. Everything was fresh that day, and his wings were great. His pulled pork was fantastic. His portions back then were amazing. Like I said, I don't know if he's still open, but at the time, that was my favorite guy by far.
Gotcha. Yeah, for me, it's a real simple one. It's Shep's Barbecue in Palestine, Texas. It's not even a regional thing. Like you got to know to drive by to get it. He grew his business a little bit, and I think he has a catering business these days. But I first had that. That was actually my first real Texas barbecue. Was at that little shack on the
Yeah.
north side of Palestine, driving from Palestine to Tyler Junior College before I went to FC. So
So
I'd
I just
stop
looked
there
it up.
after work, grab it up.
And I just looked it up, and George's is closed.
Yeah,
Sadly, figured that happened. I'll give you another one that look, the problem with like hole in the wall barbecue places in Memphis is like these places get really well known, even though there's only one place. But there's two that stick out. Memphis Barbecue Company, which is actually in South Haven, is really good. And if you've ever watched the barbecue competition on Netflix, the lady that is the female host owns that barbecue restaurant. That's her restaurant. She knows what she's talking about. And not only have good barbecue, they also have one of those Krispy Kreme burgers. They use the Krispy
yeah,
Kreme donuts for the buns. The other one is Cozy Corner, which is near St. Jude, little family run. Their pit's indoors, like it's one of those where the lid lifts off, and then so it's always smoky in there. And oddly enough, like their unique thing is I just left my mind the little bitty chickens. I forget what they're called. Cornish hens. The Cornish hens, smoked Cornish hens. Which, by the way, which is a great concept. So if you go there, you got to get the smoked Cornish hen. It's really really good. And of course, I've just not been in Texas enough to know
yeah.
all the little places.
Chris gives you advice.
Yeah,
His statement is: if you see a pit in the shape of a revolver with smoke coming out of the barrel, you stop. If it's a screened-in patio next to a porta potty, you still stop.
yeah.
That's pretty fair. All right, so let's get into the meat of the matter for today. Maybe slice off a couple slabs of information and try to use those bad metaphors. It was something else rolled around in my head. Just thinking Terry just shake his head. Really, that was just to show Terry's growing bald spot on the top of his noggin.
It is
His
not.
hair thins
Oh
out.
my word! Between us, I have the better hairline. Let's not forget.
Yeah, I think
Yours is
would
look,
pay for
dude.
this
Yours is
critique.
going way back further than mine. I mean, pretty soon they're going to be selling signage on the front of your head. I mean,
Hey, straight up, if
bald
I could make some
spot,
cash on that in the broadcast, have a little
bald
billboard up there, I
spot.
probably would.
Yeah. My favorite broadcast of you recently, by the way, was the one where they put a big black diamond in the middle of the screen, and I couldn't see you, but I could hear you. It was fantastic. Y'all should go with that
Yeah,
every week.
that'd probably be a good idea. Less distracting. If I could just change my voice to make it sound less like me, it'd probably be even better.
What if
So
we could modify everybody's voice to be Don Truex? Have you ever thought about that?
it can be done.
Like, look at this
There is an
thing.
app for that.
The Don with the Don Truex Preacher app. Everybody's live stream come out with "Good day, my Bible is open to the great Gospel of Mark," and that's not even close.
The second division of Second Corinthians.
The second division of the Corinthian letter.
Yeah. Anyway, so last 2 weeks we talked about some of the particulars of what would constitute or be identified for our perspective an unhealthy church. And what does that environment kind of entail? I want to make two quick clarifications. And when and if Edwin shows up, I'm probably going to have to repeat this. But when we talk about unhealthy, we realize that in the New Testament, there are particular words that are used in a negative sense to describe churches, like unsound or sound, as our kind of corollary ideas. We're not necessarily limiting this concept to the use of those particular words. Those words are important. The context of them is more important. And the general teaching of the New Testament is even superior to that. And so I'm not being hooked into sound church, unsound church rhetoric. I'm talking about the overall community environment of Christians, their leadership, their teaching, their service, their work together. They are healthy or unhealthy. Maybe we could say, I'm thinking in terms of Revelation chapter 2 and 3, when you have the spectrum of spiritual development on display in those churches. But I would certainly include any New Testament body as well in comparison to churches today. Hope that clarification is accurate enough. And then I'm just going to tell Edwin to scroll back to the 10-minute mark to get it.
Well, I think so. If I could be as bold to say that you look at those churches in Revelation, we would probably label some of those unhealthy, even though they still are considered to be, maybe the word would be sound. I mean, their lampstands not put out. Okay, so, but if you had to choose between those 7 churches, I think your top choice is pretty easy. And there's a couple that you're like, no way. I mean, now that doesn't, by the way, that doesn't deny the fact that those churches still are recognized. It's just, I think from what we're talking about, they have work to do. And all churches have some work to do, but they had a lot of work to do in that sense.
So I'm going to give you my first criteria, and it's very broad. Like we're saying, what is a healthy church? I'm going to say that it needs to be active. There needs to be activity in each of the areas we're going to further kind of delve into. There has to be liveliness in the group. You and I both have probably been in gospel meetings as a visitor or as an evangelist, where you go into a building, the group is 20 people, the building is 300 capacity, and they haven't been that full since insert a date in the past. That liveliness is essential as one of 2 checkpoints, either as the goal or the present tense. There has to be some liveliness in the group in any area we might further define. And if they are dead, you can tell it with any number of key factors, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for some growth, either spiritual growth, transformational views. Numerical growth counts because God gives increase. That's a healthy church. And nobody should dismiss that reality. They say, well, they were just got wet, or the guy who does the preaching, he's just super dynamic. Bottom line, that's increase that God has granted to that community of believers, and that's a healthy church. Now, they may have growth that has to take place afterwards, but that's the later down the road. So that's going to be my first criteria, is there has to be some life there that we could quantify as saying they're doing stuff, they're moving, they're engaging. What about you, Terry? Where might you start with this kind of pictorial layout?
I think you need to see a present heartbeat. Right, there has to be some life, some energy, and I'll even follow that up to say that energy needs to be outward and not just inward. It needs to really be both outward and inward. But I think one of the things I would just kind of maybe add a commentary to that activity is, if there's some churches that you and I have been around, I think in the past, where their main activity that they're involved in is still the idea of conflict. And so when I look for a church that is active, it needs to be active in areas besides conflict. So it needs to be active in areas besides pointing fingers at other churches or other people. Like, because that's a form of activity, it's just a terrible form of activity.
Right.
And so when you have a church that's not evangelistic, is not outward in its approach, but they like to host, let's say, debates that take on all kinds of things, that may not be the best form of activity for health in that sense.
And I was thinking in terms that's connected to this. If you talk about activity and liveliness, over the years, you've probably heard, some of those are probably listening, and they talk about the work of the church, and they'll talk about edification, they'll talk about evangelism, they'll even talk about benevolence. I think you can actually determine a little bit of that livelihood, that liveliness, by going to look at 2 things that will make you uncomfortable. One, go look at the ledger and see what their benevolence look like, not their evangelism wages. They could pay anybody to do that monkey job, including Terry and I. Not how much they spent buying class materials, but actually look at, like, were they genuinely benevolent? And if it's not done through the congregation's treasury, investigate and say, do they help each other or others?
Like
I will tell you,
I think one of those questions I ask Phil is, what's your benevolence budget?
yeah.
Because
Do
what
you
I found
spend
is a
it?
lot of churches, but even if they don't spend it because there's not a need, that's completely different from having a budget. And I know of some places that just refuse to budget for benevolence, and that's a real problem. That means that your approach is bad from the beginning.
Yeah.
Because if you
From
don't budget for this, then you're going to plan not to do it.
Right. So, from a biblical context standpoint, Jesus does accurately say, "You will always have the poor." And you say, "Well, okay, we're always going to have them. What are we going to do? Help them?" And if you're not acknowledging those 2 points, then our goal of saying we want to be a healthy church is going to be very difficult, because a lot of the key criteria to demonstrate maturity in your faith, maturity in your character, is seen in those areas. And in particular, if your congregation spans across demographics, you're going to have some individuals whose key spirituality is by demonstrating their generosity. If God has blessed them financially, you need to give them the open door to be benevolent, both in the congregational context and then encourage and admonish them to do so externally beyond that. And so that's something that has to be part of the equation. And never let someone sell you on the idea that evangelism is where that generosity is found. And like, well, we pay for the preacher. That's not the thing. And if it is the thing, then there's a couple of fundamental flaws in the logic that surrounds that.
Yeah,
So I would
absolutely.
probably, throw that in there and say I would start from the bottom of the ledger. Almost always, it seems, the benevolence is the bottom of the idea, and then I would actually start moving up and thinking in terms of the relationship of the believers. A healthy church is going to have individuals who fundamentally like being around each other. Um, I think we've talked about this before, and I'll tie it in this way. Um, Effective evangelism includes not only drawing people to the cross, but immersing them in the culture of disciples. And that happens not just in structured Bible classes and the sermon and the worship in our congregate experiences, but it happens very much specifically in homes, in parks, in adventures together and experiences together where you share life through the lens of faith. And so a healthy church is going to be a place where that takes place. And it's both intentional and consequential. Like, you're choosing this, but then there are consequences to that choice where you get to know each other better. You experience life together. It should not be a burden if you get invited to celebrate a Christian's experience in your congregation. Oh, they graduated from high school. Oh, they're getting married. Oh, they're at a T-ball game. Like, you may not be able to make it everything, but you should not feel like it's a burden, like you're being overpressured, because you kind of want to be there because you kind of like them and they're kind of fun. You start thinking about these things in a different sense that way.
Yeah, I think the relationship factor, that sense of fellowship between each other, is something that needs to be seen visibly. And by the way, I think about that, Phil. I think for me at least, I mean, this is not always solid, by the way, but there seems to be a feeling when you walk into even the worship setting. You can feel and see by how they interact before and after, and just their overall spirit and attitude, whether that kind of relationship exists. Like, I don't have to know that they're going to T-ball games and that kind of stuff, but I can sometimes, visiting, I can see that just in how they interact
Yeah.
together in the building.
Right.
If they look
Oh,
like
yeah.
complete strangers while they're at the building before we start to worship, that's
And they
because they're
are.
complete strangers, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a powerful thing. So,
And Chris talks about this transformational concept, like we convert people from to. That's in part what you're doing with these relationships, and you can see them catching up with each other, not because it's been a week since they saw each other, but it's been 8 hours. Hey, are you still tired from last night? We
Yeah.
were out doing whatever together.
Right.
And so that's part of that principled model of what you're looking for. It also actually has, I think, something super important on the evangelistic side, which kind of moving up in these different areas. In working with a number of believers whose ages would probably range from 18 to 45 over the last month or so, in some quiet studies that I've been able to be part of, a lot of that group has talked about their struggles and the struggles of some of their friends to adjust into spiritual maturity while still feeling like their faithfulness is identified by keeping a list. And this is a normal thing. Terry and I probably experienced the same kind of emotional struggles when we were 18 to 25. And then it changes as you get older. Like, okay, did I do all my things? If I do this, someone's going to say that. Like, that's a normal experience to go through. Spiritually, we've got to kind of balance both law and grace in a way that's biblical. And I say law on two fronts. Jesus deals with this in Mark chapter 7 and 8 quite a bit in the way that he handles the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. But we still struggle with man-made tradition that we treat like law because we're people, we're humans. We make decisions that we elevate to the equivalent of God's word, and then we create a little fence a little farther out from that, and we say, well, I'm not going to get too close to the edge. When we forget that the actual edge space is a space God said to be in. Like, you can be over there. It's totally awesome to be over there. And we might need to be there in order to extend grace to the person who's on the other edge of the ledge. Like, they're falling off. You won't reach them if you're not near them. So building a community that allows that to happen also gives them the space to be open and transparent with you when they're struggling. Because if they don't know you, elder, if they don't know you, preacher, if they don't know you, deacon, or just person who sits down from them on the pew beyond the fact that you don't sing on key on Sunday, they're never going to tell you what they're struggling with. It's just simply not going to happen. And so that's evangelism in its own context, because you're drawing people back. Restoration to me is evangelism. It's gospel work in that way.
Yeah.
So a healthy church is going to enable that. It's going to embolden people to feel comfortable to participate in that spiritual space.
Right. I think another thing for me that a healthy church is going to be, when, like, if you're looking, is they're going to have some kind of structure and organization for successful teaching. Now, I think that's seen at a lot of different levels, but I think one of the clearest ways for that, for me, Phil, is in their Bible classes. And I think a lot of times in the children's Bible class, that's where it's really evident a lot of times. Is there a plan? Is there a structure in place? Is there some kind of, this is what we do? And by the way, I think that includes even the groups that don't have kids in certain ages. You ever showed up to a place with your kids and like, oh, well, we don't have that class, or they don't know what to do with your kid? So if a healthy church has solutions in place for all of that, and that's something that's very important. And when you start investigating that deeper, it's kind of like looking at the budget and looking at the financials for benevolence. You start seeing that there's more than just, hey, we got to have a Bible class, but there's a structure, there's a strategy, there's a plan for all of that. That needs to be evident in what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think so. Now you've got kind of a holistic look at some of these things. You've talked a little bit about evangelism, a little bit about identification, a little bit about benevolence. These are going to create healthy experiences. But let me add another context to that. which is thinking about the mentorship of future leadership. Um, that you're going to see individual participation in that process. That
Yeah.
it's not just, okay, we're going to wait until the second guy shows up, which is statistically normal. Like, we're just waiting for that second guy. Almost every congregation I've been part of that does not have elders has predetermined who the first guy is. And a lot of times there's problems with that. Not always, because that first guy already knows he's the guy. And so he either is really eager or ultra reluctant. Both of those things produce problems.
Yeah. And in
Um,
some cases, he's already being the guy, even though he's not the guy yet.
yeah.
I mean, that's
And
part of
if
the reason
it's,
he gets that moniker put to him is because in the business meeting, he's the guy that leads the business meeting. He's the guy everybody listens to. He's the guy driving the bus. They just need another guy to go next to him so he can make it official a lot of times. And
yeah.
that's where you said, if he's the eager one, that's a lot of times is not a good thing.
Yeah. So I would probably include that intentional mentorship plan in. It says that makes a healthy church. Let me indicate that that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that the churches that do not have deacons, that do not have elders, are unhealthy. They very much can be, in some cases, the healthiest church in the region because they are growing in the way that God needs them to grow in the present time. I think that's probably something else to be aware of. And those are all at least the starting points for those dialogues. And I would probably start laying out, how do we get there? Like, if I'm a healthy church, how do we stay there? Do I see signs of impending disease coming in? All right, so I'm the watchman on the wall, looking out. I see, calamity coming. I want to be aware of that. Those are some of the things that I would probably prioritize in the sense of looking at it and saying, here's what I'm looking for. And by the way,
Yeah.
preachers don't always get to pick that fight, because we don't often get to pick where we worship in the same way that other families sometimes do. It's not
Yeah.
exclusive,
So
but
to follow that up, by the way, just because you don't have elders or deacons doesn't mean that you're unhealthy. But if you don't have elders and deacons and you're not trying to fix that in any way, there's no plan, there's no effort, there's no energy towards that, that would make you unhealthy. Because if you can't recognize that you need those things and you need to be working on that, if you can't recognize that, then that's an unhealthy way to survive in that sense. Um,
yeah. And something that Hal pointed out earlier, I wanted to kind of bring this back up to the top here. He talks about how, there's above phrases on any side that set the other side off. Careful listening, honesty, and loving, attitudes. I guess I'll kind of summarize there for a second. Those are things that are necessary for real harmony and reconciliation in groups. That's why you have to have those connections between people on an individual basis, so you can actually navigate those stressors, those difficulties, those faith up and down type aspects. And so I think it's important then for us, as we're kind of thinking about what makes healthy environments, realize that there's going to be some level of dissension that takes place in any context. And dissent is not unfaithfulness. Um, I think there's probably a portion of folks who sometimes think that, well, you guys are all the same and it's okay. Now, you need healthy dissent in order to find the balance that's best for a group spiritually. You absolutely have to have it.
yeah,
Um, you
it's like
know,
a healthy eldership. By the way, is the same thing. You don't need four guys that are all the same guy. Believe it or not.
right.
What works best is you have four people that have four different perspectives to some degree on across a variety of spectrums. Because when you get into this group think echo chamber thing and everything goes the same direction, or even if the majority, or even if there's a controlling kind of faction within whatever we're talking about, there's not enough variety to make sure that you're doing the right thing usually. And so dissension is a good thing. Um, I think that's something that we often don't understand.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot more stuff that we can consider it now. We're hitting our kind of little intentional time break here at 11:27. Terry, I have at least two announcements. Number one, I will not be on any broadcast next week. So whatever Terry is doing is both awesome and his responsibility if it's not.
Probably
And so,
nothing. Let's be honest. We're probably not going to do it. We're probably going to take a
right.
break. That's usually what happens when one of us are gone anymore.
And then I think next week after that, we'll be back again, heading into some level of summer hiatus, probably for June and July, mainly due to scheduling and a good value of rest. And so rest has its place too. And so we're looking forward to that. Terry, any last things before we close off for today? Aside from having the joy of no Edwin.
Oh, I love Edwin.
We love Edmund, but
I mean,
that's,
it's always good to have a voice of dissension, right? So, no, I think one of the things, by the way, about the taking of the break is we'd love some feedback from people about what you'd like going forward. We've often talked about, Phil and I privately, what the shelf life of this little thing is, and we're not sure of that from time to time. So, if you'd give us a shout out and let us know maybe your thoughts about that maybe that break's more permanent, maybe the return from the break is not weekly. We're open to all kinds of suggestions and would love to hear from the four of you that are routinely here.
yeah. I think it's probably eight, but
7 or 8.
they just pop 7 or 8. Hey, and as always, if there's something we can do in your work, we want to encourage you in that. If there's an opportunity that you know of to preach, we want to pray for that. If there's someone we can serve, just let us know. And may God be graceful to you.